Hello and welcome. Imagine, if you will, that living right next door to us is a colossal civilization. They outnumber humanity by 3 million to 1, while our own civilization spans a mere 10,000 years. Theirs has flourished for a breathtaking 100 million. We depend on them completely. We constantly interact with them, and honestly, we would surely perish without their help. Yet this ancient, essential civilization seems entirely, beautifully unaware of our existence. And this isn't some fantasy, and it's certainly not some kind of simple bacteria. These beings have built their own sophisticated society. They maintain a clear hierarchy, they hold professions, climb career ladders, teach their young, and make crucial collective decisions. Over the last 100 million years, they have easily outlasted every dominant species this planet has ever seen. We are, of course, talking about bees. Before we drift deeper into this remarkable story, I'd love for you to join our quiet little community. Please take a moment and let me know in the comments, where are you in the world right now, and what time is it for you? I'm always fascinated to see just how far our small gathering of midnight historians has reached. Tonight, we'll be uncovering some of their most intriguing secrets. We'll find out exactly how many bees are on Earth and how much they weigh collectively. We'll travel to where the planet's largest bee makes its home. We'll discover the astonishing way they navigate and find their way back home. And perhaps most importantly, we'll explore what would truly happen to humanity if they disappeared, and what these magnificent creatures do when winter arrives. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the details of this tiny, enormous world soothe you to sleep. Now, let's begin.
In your feed, in the dark, abandoned barn, dimly lit through some cracks in the plank walls, he stumbled upon a pile of some cocoons attached to the ceiling and walls with repulsive tendrils. Some oozed slippery slime. Something alive and distinctly alien was maturing in these cocoons. This might well be the beginning of a run-of-the-mill sci-fi movie about aliens, and you've probably seen something like this on screen. You must have probably thought, oh, thank God there's nothing like that here on Earth. Are you sure, though? How about this? Yeah, this is a nest of Trigona itama bees. But how is this possible? After all, even children know that a honeycomb looks like this. It's interesting that such a perfect hexagonal shape of honeycombs doesn't surprise you, even if it looks like something that came straight out of a 3D printer. This feels normal because we've grown so used to it. But if you think about it, this is nothing short of astonishing. However, these honeycombs look downright alien. But what if we told you that the shape of the nests is the least surprising of all the things you didn't know about bees? In case you didn't know it before, you may have gathered that these familiar little fellows aren't the only species. There are over 20,000 bee species globally, which is more than all mammal and bird species combined. But those are species. What about the total number of all individuals? This gigantic number is hard to fathom. Even if it were known, it's almost impossible to accurately answer this question due to scarce data and highly divergent information known to science. Over 96% of bee species are studied poorly, and even a higher percentage is documented insufficiently. But let's still give it a try. We can compare it with ants, whose number was roughly inferred from the available data. You'll see a bit later why exactly we choose to compare bees with ants. In total, there are about 11,000 ant species in the world, and the total number of individuals is 10,000 trillion, or 10 quadrillion. As you already know, there are twice as many types of bees. However, just doubling the number of ants would be an oversimplification.
Let's consider this from a different angle.
we still have some idea of the number of domesticated honeybees, Apis malaria, because there are at least some statistics on the number of hives in the global honey production industry. According to various estimates, there are up to 100 million hives with domesticated honeybees in the world. There are roughly from 10,000 to 60,000 bees in each hive. Thus, there are between 1 and 6 trillion domesticated honeybees in the world. The only question is, how many colonies of wild honeybees are there? Do you think there are more or less numerous than domesticated ones? The answer is at least as many as domesticated ones, with some estimates indicating significantly higher numbers. However, let's consider the lower limit for the sake of caution. Everything's clear with the honeybee, but what about the other 20,000 species? Keep in mind that only a small fraction of them have been domesticated. So, to make things simple, we'll consider only wild ones and roughly assume that each species also has a population of about 1 trillion individuals. The average weight of a honeybee is 100 milligrams. Let's take it as an approximate average value of all other types. By multiplying 1 trillion bees by 100 milligrams, which is the weight of one individual, we get 100,000 tons, the total weight of one species. Keep in mind that this is only a single species out of 20,000. Moving on, if we assume that other bee species have roughly the same population and weight, we multiply 100,000 tons by 20,000 species and get 2 billion metric tons. According to recent estimates, humanity weighs about 390 million metric tons in total. It turns out that all bees in the world outweigh humanity by at least 5 times, and the total bee population across all species is estimated at 20 quadrillion. Let us remind you that this is the bare minimum as we based our calculations on the lowest possible value. Once again, this is a very rough estimate. The true population numbers for all bee species remain unknown, but the total order of numbers could be, well, like that. These creatures are found almost everywhere, wherever there are flowers. They live on all continents except Antarctica. Every day, bees pollinate over 1 trillion flowers globally. Just so you know, that's a figure with 12 zeros. Not all types of bees live in colonies and store large amounts of honey for future use. On the contrary, they're a minority. Such a particularly social species as the honeybee is almost an exception. There are only a handful of such species. The majority of bee species lead solitary lives. By the way, why do they even produce honey, and why do they collect pollen? It's quite simple. Bees eat honey and pollen. Pollen is a source of proteins, and honey is a source of carbohydrates. So does that mean when beekeepers collect fresh honey, they're in a way robbing the bees? Well, sort of. But this is perhaps one of the most minor ethical problems in the animal-human interactions. Thanks to people, there are many more bees than there would be if we hadn't bred them specifically for honey production. Thus, humans are far from being enemies to bees, but they still have some real enemies. As a child, you might have learned from cartoons that wasps are bees' worst enemies. That's right, but at the same time, they are also their closest relatives, just like ants. In fact, ants and bees are closer to wasps than we are to chimps. Having emerged around the start of the Cretaceous period, about 100 million years ago, bees and ants became the most successful social insects in the world. They've occupied many terrestrial ecosystems, easily outlived dinosaurs along with everyone else, and had a global environment impact, which continues to this day. After all, almost 90% of wild plants and 75% of the world's leading crops rely on pollination. Every third mouthful of our food is thanks to pollinators. Such as bees' pollination-reliant crops much more valuable than those that don't. For example, if you were to remove everything from a Big Mac that directly or indirectly depends on bees, you would end up with nothing but the bun, because wheat doesn't require pollination. According to some estimates, if bees suddenly disappeared, humanity would survive no more than 4 years. We would all starve to death. It's so fortunate to have them around. Bees are a very diverse group of animals that can differ tens of times in size. For example, the smallest dwarf bee in the world is Perdita minima, which grows to only 2 millimeters. As one cartoon character once said, "It's tough to be a bug, but Perdita minima has learned how to use this size to its advantage. It can sneak almost anywhere it needs, much less food, and doesn't have to build a large shelter. A day's worth of pollen for a regular bee can last this tiny one a whole week." But such a pipsqueak of an insect hardly seems impressive. The big bugs are where it's at. By the way, we have a video on giant prehistoric bugs. Now, how do you like this monster? The size of an adult human's thumb, with jaws like those of a stag beetle. This is the world's largest bee. Megachile Pluto, or Wallace's giant bee. It was first described by British entomologist Alfred Wallace in 1858, but soon after, the species' population drastically declined. The last sighting was in 1981 on the Indonesian island of Baekhyun. Researchers then found 6 nests. Since then, almost 40 years passed without any new data, and the giant bee was considered extinct. But one recent discovery has made quite a splash. On February 21, 2019, an expedition of scientists from Princeton University and a local naturalist found a female nesting in a colony of wood termites in Indonesia. Researchers retraced Wallace's route based on his notes and saw a giant bee on the same Halmahera island. It was absolutely breathtaking to see this giant bulldog of an insect that we weren't sure existed anymore, said photographer Clay Bolt, who was one of the expedition members. Given the average wingspan of an individual is about 6 centimeters, his awe is hardly surprising. The females of this species needed a giant jaw to collect nesting material. They inhabit termite mounds inside tree trunks, isolating their home from the termites using tree resin. The discovered female was released back into the wild after a photo and video shoot. These bees are rarely found in nature now. Now, let's see how this baby looks compared to a regular bee. However, when we say regular, we somehow assume that everyone knows everything about honeybees, but that's simply not true. Therefore, from now on, our story will focus entirely on them. One honeybee can produce 1 tablespoon of honey in a lifetime. To produce a 270-gram jar of Big Island bees' honey, 683 bees must do the following: fly approximately 52,589,000 flowers, bring to the hive and process 2.7 kilograms of nectar. Keep in mind that this is just for a 270-gram jar of honey. To make 1 kilogram of honey, bees need to visit between 4 and 8 million flowers. We bet honey doesn't seem so expensive now, does it? Entire factories are working to produce this delicacy. Each has an average of up to 50,000 employees. The average size of such a factory is 46 by 46 centimeters. No, we didn't confuse the units of measurement because we're talking about the size of a standard commercial hive. The average bee swarm weighs 6 to 8 kilograms. And calling such a hive a factory is not an exaggeration. Tens of thousands of living beings work in the hive every day, each within its job description, literally. During its lifespan,
Almost every worker bee manages to change several professions, from janitor and housekeeper to nanny, builder, groomer, mortician, and security guard. Only after this does the bee begin the task we know it for: pollinating flowers. We said these are all worker bees, so are there any non-working ones? Of course. Honeybees are social insects, which means they live in colonies. They have a lot in common with ants in this regard, but the bee society is quite unique in its own way. The queen is the most important and vital member of the colony. The colony's survival, or its eventual degradation and depopulation, depends on her. There is only one queen in a colony, and the tens of thousands of other bees are her offspring. With rare exceptions, during transitional periods, there may be 2 queens, an old and a young one, or a mixed colony. The queen is the only full-fledged female in the hive. Only she alone can lay eggs, and that's all she does throughout her life. Who are the worker bees then? Males? No, they are also females, but their reproductive function is suppressed. Interestingly, ant colonies are designed the same way.
Well, they are relatives after all. The worker bee is the main living unit of the colony, the main engine of this metaphorical factory. They do absolutely all the work and are known as the most hardworking creatures on the planet. It's no wonder that bees embody selflessness. That's the way they are. We'll talk more about the extraordinary sacrifices of worker bees later. The third citizen of the colony is a male bee known as a drone. Unlike the queen, there are many of them, and unlike that of worker bees, their reproductive system is fully functional. What are they doing? It's logical to assume they ensure reproduction, since drones are fully mature males, right? But what else? Well, almost nothing. But things are much more interesting than they seem here, and soon you'll find out what we mean. In the meantime, let's find out what a bee is as a living creature. Like any insect, a bee looks like something perfect, especially under macro photography. A flawless mechanism with mesmerizing alien forms. And it's for a reason it comes off this way. The bee's body is supported by a sturdy chitinous exoskeleton. In this respect, bees have more in common with fungi than with us humans. This isn't a joke because chitin is actually found in fungal cell membranes. A bee's body consists of three parts: the head, thorax, and abdomen. The body is covered with hairs in some places, very densely. The body parts are connected by thin elastic membranes. There are 5 eyes on the head. Yep, you heard that right. And we are not mistaken. Bees have 2 visible big compound facet eyes, as well as 3 simple small ones that aren't as noticeable. They are located on the top of the head. Very soon, you'll find out what kind of vision the bees have with such a bizarre configuration. There are also 2 amusing antennae on the head, which consist of several segments, 11 in females and 12 in drones. You've probably seen how bees feel everything around them with their antennae, but this is by no means an organ of touch, but rather something unexpected. Just be patient, you'll learn about it in a minute. In front, the mouth is covered by a narrow chitinous strip, which constitutes the upper lip. The upper jaws, or mandibles, are located on the sides. The strongly shifted lower lip, along with a pair of lower jaws, forms a proboscis. The abdomen of females is divided into 6 segments, while drones have 7. A bee has 4 wings, not 2, as many mistakenly believe. They are formed at the pupal stage. The front wings are larger, the back ones smaller. In flight, the front and back wings join together to form a single plane, using small hooks on the front edge of the rear pair.
Wings, that's why it seems like there are only 2 wings. When the bee lands, these hooks detach and the wings fold along the body. The total number of such hooks is from 17 to 28. A bee can fly as fast as 65 kilometers per hour without a load, and could reach up to 20 or even 30 kilometers per hour with a load, while making 200 to 250 wings beats per second. They can fly up to 3 to 4 kilometers from the hive, sometimes much farther. Finally, the most interesting thing is what and how bees sense. Compound eyes consist of a huge number of tiny eyelets called facets. The queen has the fewest number of 3 to 4,000. Worker bees need them more, so they have up to 5,000 facets per eye. With up to 10,000 facets, drones have the sharpest eyes. In general, bees have excellent vision and navigate well using their mosaic eyes. But then, why do they also have those 3 tiny simple eyes on the top of their heads? We are yet to understand this magic. For now, we can only speculate. Bees can see polarized light, meaning light where electromagnetic waves travel in strictly one direction. This allows them to navigate using the sun even when it's hidden behind clouds. As for color vision, bees don't see the color we perceive as red. But in addition to yellow and blue, they can distinguish ultraviolet. Now let's get to those amusing antennae and uncover their secret. For bees, they serve as organs of smell. Bees don't breathe air the way we do by pumping it into the lungs. Air enters directly through openings on their bodies called spiracles. Bees don't inhale air, so they don't need to touch something to smell it. That's what the antennae are for. They contain olfactory pores. How sensitive are they? Well, sensitive enough for anyone to be jealous. Of course, it's not appropriate to compare olfactory organs with radically different operating principles, but in terms of sensitivity, bees can certainly compete with dogs. Where there's smell, there's taste. And do bees have it? Absolutely. Bees' taste sensors are located in their throats, on the proboscis on antenna, and even on their legs. Imagine having such a superpower, holding a juicy burger in your hands for a couple of minutes and feeling like you don't need to eat it at all. No nutritionists would definitely go broke. Bees do have hearing, but naturally it doesn't function the same way as ours. Bees perceive vibrations through special organs located on some parts of their thorax and abdomen and on the lower parts of the front legs. Moreover, bees have detectors for temperature, humidity, and even carbon dioxide levels. All of these are located on the same antennae. And finally, it's worth mentioning something that bees don't use as a sensory organ, but can make someone else feel quite acutely. Of course, we're talking about stinging apparatus. Yep, it's actually a whole apparatus, which is located at the posterior end of the abdomen and consists of 2 poisonous glands, a reservoir for poison, and a serrated stinger. The latter is about 2 millimeters long. The stinger has barbs that cause it to get stuck in the skin of most victims. For the same reason, a bee's sting is fatal to the bee itself. Having pierced the skin with its stinger, the bee instinctively tries to fly away, and the stinger, along with a capsule of poison and a piece of intestine, escapes from the bee's abdomen. The severed stinger contracts for some time, injecting venom, a ghastly sight to behold. For a non-allergic person, a bee sting is unpleasant but entirely harmless from one bee. But provoking an entire colony is unwise. 500 stings can send the poor guy straight to the hospital, and 1,000 would probably be fatal. For an allergic person, even one sting could be enough to cause a potentially fatal anaphylactic shock. By the way, this kind of allergy isn't so uncommon. According to statistics, up to 7% of people are allergic to bee venom. But in reality, bees are far less aggressive than many believe. Under normal circumstances, a bee has no business with you, and if you don't
bother, it won't bother you, and drones can't harm you at all, even if they want to, because it has neither poison nor even a stinger. Like many other insects, bees go through 4 stages of development: egg, larvae, pupa, and adult. How exactly do all these amazing metamorphoses happen? This is very different from the metamorphosis of a butterfly because it involves well-coordinated teamwork. It all starts with an egg deposited by the queen. In each cell, there are fertilized and unfertilized eggs. The latter gives rise to drones. From the fertilized ones come worker bees and, if needed, queens. The queen needs 16 days to fully develop. The worker bee takes almost a third longer, 21 days, and the drone takes even longer, 24 days. Let's first consider how a worker bee develops. 3 days after the queen lays an egg, it turns into a larvae. Healthy larvae are white and shiny in the light. Larvae grow quickly and eat 24 hours a day. In the first few days, bees feed the larvae a special substance called royal jelly. It is a chemically complex and nutrient-rich white substance produced by the nurse worker bees in the mandibular gland. The diet is strictly individual for worker bees, drones, and future queens. The jelly for a 1 to 2 day old worker bee larvae contain a lot of protein, up to 70% of dry weight, and relatively few carbohydrates and fats. For 3 to 5 day old larvae, the protein content is reduced by almost half, but the proportion of sugars is higher as the stored honey is used. The jelly for drone larvae contain up to 60% protein. As the larvae grow, they molt
5 times, becoming 1,500 times larger than the tiny worm that hatched from the egg. After 5 days, worker bees seal the cells with larvae inside. The sealed larvae gradually turn into pupa. At this stage, the larvae transforms into a bee. Wings, legs, and eyes begin to form. Then the color of the eyes changes. At first they are pink, then purple, and finally turn black. Hairs appear on the body. The pupal formation process takes 12 days. The insect stays inside the cell for up to 9 days. During this time, it doesn't receive food, but uses up the 8 days' worth of preliminary supplies. The fully formed bee chews through the cell cap and joins its family. Both queens and drones develop similarly to a worker bee, with the only difference in diet and timing. And depending on who exactly was born, a queen bee, a worker bee, or a drone, the lives of these 3 creatures will be strikingly different, because nature has designed a unique program for everyone, and it should be followed to the letter. Now, let's take a closer look at the typical fate of each, starting with the queen. Keep in mind that any fertilized egg can become the hive's queen, but which one specifically depends largely on the worker bees. They decide which cells will become queen cells and what to do with them next. Indeed, they prepare not just one cell, but several, even though the collective mind plans to raise only one queen. A larvae hatches 3 days after the eggs are laid, and the bees begin to feed it royal jelly. It continues to subside exclusively on royal jelly until the cell is sealed. This strict diet ensures that the larvae will develop into a queen. The larvae grows rapidly, and 8 to 9 days after the egg stage, the bees seal the queen cell with a porous cap made from wax and bee bread. Inside, the larvae transforms into a pupa over 7 to 8 days, and then into an adult, a virgin queen bee. The first thing the virgin queen bee does upon emerging from the cell is mercilessly killing its rivals, other young queens. This is why bees lay a hole of queens, to ensure that only the strongest, healthiest, and most agile one survives. Everything happens here according to natural laws. 3 to 4 days after emerging from the queen cell, the virgin queen starts to undertake orientation flights. She will have to familiarize herself with the area and the surroundings. This takes several days. The queen needs to get used to flying fast, as she needs to prepare for an epic event, mating. And we're not exaggerating about the epicness, because bee mating is quite a spectacle. On the 7th to 10th day of life, the virgin queen makes a nuptial flight to mate with drones. This flight lasts about 20 minutes and occurs at great heights for bees, up to 20 meters or even higher, with considerable speed up to the maximum bee speed of about 50 to 60 kilometers per hour. Why go to such lengths? For the same reason other species have similar tournaments, to ensure that only the strongest males end up passing on their genes. And this is a case where there will be more than one winner, far from just one. The queen is usually inseminated by 7 to 10 drones. Sometimes their number is higher, and the queen may venture out more than once. Ultimately, the queen can mate with dozens of drones, all for the sake of genetic diversity. By the way, the queen prefers to fly several miles away from the nest to minimize fertilization by males from her own colony. Bee queens are absolute record holders among social insects, alongside some species of nomadic ants, in terms of the number of matings with males. For the fortunate males, everything ends almost as soon as it begins. Literally everything, including their life. Having caught up with the queen, the drone extends its reproductive organ, the endophallus, inserts it into the female's abdomen, and injects all the sperm into her under enormous pressure. At this moment, the drone literally squeezes out all its juices. He uses almost all of the hemolymph in his body to create an explosive thrust of cataline fluid. This is a kind of hydroshock, which sometimes can even be heard without any special equipment. Of course, the drone dies instantly after this. Its abdomen is torn to shreds, and the endophallus detaches and remains in the queen, while the now dead drone falls lifelessly to the ground. But within a few minutes, the next suitor reaches the queen. He removes the severed endophallus of his deceased predecessor from the queen's abdomen, only to repeat the poor fellow's fate. This is how a dozen or two drones end their lives. But for the queen, everything is just beginning. She now carries a priceless treasure, the sperm of several dozen drones. It's invaluable because the female mates only once in her lifetime and then carries the acquired sperm for the rest of her life, using it as needed to fertilize her eggs. The queen begins laying them almost immediately after she successfully mates and returns to the hive. She will do this for the rest of her life, without any distractions. The queen lays one egg in each cell, moving gradually from one to the other. Before laying an egg, the queen checks the honeycomb. It must be clean, well-polished, and perfectly sized. If she doesn't like something, the queen skips the cell and moves on to the next one. The eggs are tiny but quite visible to the naked eye, measuring up to 1.5 millimeters each. The more eggs the queen lays, the smaller they become. Young queens lay larger and heavier eggs than older ones. The number of eggs laid by the same queen varies as the season progresses. At the very beginning, she produces about 100 eggs per day, which is very few. However, as the weather warms up and bees start seeking nectar-rich flowers, the hive begins to receive fresh pollen. During this period, the queen turns into a real egg-laying machine, producing about 1,000 eggs a day, and at the peak of the active season, up to 2,000. The number can reach 3,500 in exceptional cases. It's easy to figure out that with an egg size of about 1 millimeter, the total volume of these thousands of eggs per day must be larger than the queen herself. Something doesn't add up here, but that's exactly how it is. During these periods, the mass of eggs laid per day can exceed the mass of the queen herself. How is that possible? It's actually quite simple. The queen eats almost continuously during this time. Worker bees diligently ensure she lacks nothing. This is how the queen lays an average of 150 to 160,000 eggs per season. The process itself is quite an engineering feat. The queen positions eggs vertically at the very bottom of the cell. Not all eggs are fertilized by the queen. As you already know, drones emerge from unfertilized eggs, and this process is by no means random. The eggs are fertilized in the womb of the bee. For this, she has a special pump to draw up the seminal fluid collected during mating. But sometimes this happens, and sometimes it doesn't. How and why does the queen decide whether to fertilize an egg or not? Well, it's actually not the queen who makes the decision, but the cell. Of course, in a figurative sense. We weren't kidding when we said that egg laying is a whole engineering feat. Here's how it works. When the queen dips her abdomen into a cell, she bends at a certain angle. There are special sensitive hairs on her body that touch the edges of the narrow cell when performing this movement. That creates a nerve impulse that causes seminal pump contraction. A drop of semen reaches the egg, which means that a worker bee will hatch from it. Here's what happens when the queen reaches the drone cells. These cells are initially larger than those designed for worker bees, which makes sense as drones are significantly larger and require space to grow. So when the queen lowers her abdomen into the more spacious drone cell, the sensitive hairs don't touch the edge. There's no trigger for the impulse. Consequently, the pump doesn't contract and the egg remains unfertilized. All this happens automatically and the queen doesn't think about anything. What other tasks does the queen perform? Actually, none. The queen's lifespan is between 3 and 5 years, sometimes longer, but rarely more than 7 to 8 years. And that's only in the wild. Beekeepers replace an aging queen much earlier. But the beekeeper isn't the only one who can decide to replace the queen. This can be done by the hive itself. This is where collective intelligence comes into play. Bees will mercilessly kill a sick or injured queen and immediately prepare special queen cells for breeding a whole new series of queens. The strongest one will survive, kill all her sisters,
and start a new and endless cycle of reproduction. Nature is cruel but efficient, although we must admit that the hive is not devoid of mercy, but it is still imbued with the cold rationality insects typically have. A retiring queen may be allowed to live a little longer until the young one begins to lay eggs. This is when two queens might coexist in the hive, but eventually the old lady is either killed or expelled. In the latter case, the poor retiree is destined to die of starvation. Thus, despite being the most important and protected member of the colony all her life, the queen dies a tragic and unfair death. And her life is extremely monotonous, something that definitely cannot be said about worker bees, which have fascinating life stories. The development of a worker bee from an egg to an adult insect lasts 21 days. This includes 3 days as an egg, 6 days as a larvae in an open cell, and 12 days as a larvae in pupa in a sealed cell. At the end, the bee chews through the brood cell cap and emerges. A newly emerged young bee is very weak, it can barely walk. Other, older bees immediately come to its aid, feeding it until it gets stronger. Then it immediately gets to work. It's fascinating how a worker bee climbs the career ladder throughout its life. Before taking on its main mission of collecting nectar, the bee literally starts out as a menial worker, specifically a janitor.
Let us remind you that queens are very picky when it comes to the cleanliness of their honeycombs. The bee climbs into the cell and polishes its walls and bottom by licking it clean. By the 4th day of life, young bees are already capable of feeding the older larvae with a mix of honey and bee bread. If there aren't enough nurse bees in the colony, other bees can easily switch roles to fill the vacant spots. From the 3rd to the 5th day of life, bees make short flights from the hive, but only to go to the toilet. Indeed, under no conditions do bees tolerate filth in the hive and only relieve themselves outside. By the 7th day, bees' glands start secreting royal jelly. This means the bee has been promoted. From this time, it can feed the youngest larvae up to 3 days old and queens with royal jelly. By the 12th day, bees develop wax glands. This is a major career leap, and at the same time, a great responsibility, because now the bees can build honeycombs. Some of the growing bees can also be retrained as builders if there's a need. The latter might happen when there's plenty of food. These wax glands are located on each of the 4 lower segments of the abdomen. The wax is secreted in liquid form, hits the wax plates of the abdomen, and hardens into soft, triangular scales when exposed to air. Then the bee picks them up with its leg, brushes, transfers them into its mandibles, and thoroughly kneads them into balls. After this, the building material can be used. By the way, have you ever wondered how bees manage to build combs in such a precise hexagonal shape? And why exactly is this shape? Why not squares or triangles? Firstly, it's the most efficient shape. It allows for the minimal use of building materials while maximizing the internal volume of each comb, leaving no gaps between them. But don't be quick to assume that bees manage to carry out complex calculations and determine the mathematically precise ideal shape of a honeycomb. At least wait until you hear our next fact. The truth is, bees don't make hexagonal combs, but rather circular ones, or more accurately, cylindrical ones. It's the laws of physics that make them hexagonal. Bees fill the gaps between cylindrical combs with wax. Newly built cells are very pliable because the wax is still warm. Under the force of gravity, the cylinders settle and flatten against each other, taking on a hexagonal shape. However, not everything comes down to physics. The bees do influence this natural wonder by building cells at a specific angle so that after deposition and solidification, they end up in the desired position. As if they know that the cylindrical shape isn't final. They even use their heads as a plumb line to adjust the angle of the combs and the thickness of the walls.
Finally, young bees are responsible for receiving nectar from returning forager bees. It's here that the mystery of honey making takes place. Here's how it happens. On average, fresh nectar contains about 50% water. It may range from very liquid to thicker varieties. It cannot be stored in this form for long, or else it will quickly start to ferment. Therefore, nectar processing starts in the honey crop of the forager bee. When the forager returns home, it passes the collected nectar to a worker bee. The receiver bee sucks the nectar from the mouth of the forager bee with its proboscis. The latter chews it for some time, continuing the process initiated by the forager. Then the receiving bee periodically releases nectar into the tip of the proboscis and swallows it back. The bee's saliva enzyme, invertase, breaks down complex sugars into simple ones, glucose and fructose. The bee performs this operation about 240 times with the same sip of nectar. The bees place the processed nectar
into honeycombs, but it's still nectar, not honey. Now they need to remove excess moisture from it. This is done by transferring the nectar from comb to comb until the water evaporates to at least 21% of the volume. This process takes between 8 and 10 days. During this time, honey has already formed, but it is still unripe and liquid. To speed up water evaporation, bees fan it with their wings. Hundreds of bees do this at the same time. So when you're near a hive and hear a lively buzzing inside, know that the bees aren't flying back and forth, but working as fans. When the syrup in the honeycomb reaches the desired consistency, the cells are sealed with wax. This sealing is a sort of quality mark stamped by the bees themselves. It means the honey is ready and won't spoil, and no air can enter a sealed comb. Before that, the composition is enriched with enzymes and practically sterilized. All these processes transform nectar into honey. In this state, honey can be stored not just for years, but for centuries, remaining not only edible but also delicious. In general, young bees at the age of 15 to 18 days old, who haven't been promoted to nectar foragers, continue to perform many other jobs in the hive, often changing roles and mastering a variety of professions if needed. For example, some will have to serve real military duty by guarding the nest. This is usually one of the last hive jobs for young bees. But whom do the guards protect the colony from? Anyone. The wilderness is full of sweet tooths, from other bees and wasps to all kinds of creatures, including bears. Many animals, especially birds, wouldn't mind snacking on the bees themselves. This is why some individuals are called to serve in the bee border forces, so to speak. The position of a guard isn't permanent. Some serve a day, others a week. The age of conscription also varies, from 1 to 3 weeks of age. A typically strong colony has between 10 to 20 guard bees simultaneously patrolling the hive entrance. The guarding mechanism works like this. Guard bees have excellent vision, although it's not the only thing they rely on. Bees have a friend or foe olfactory system. The smell of a bee is its passport, and each colony has its scent. Let us remind you that these segmented antennae serve as the olfactory organs. Any suspicious individuals are thoroughly sniffed and almost touched with the antenna. Guards recognize their own not just by scent, but also by behavioral patterns. Hive members usually enter leisurely and confidently, while foreign thief bees try to sneak into the hive quickly to remain unnoticed. However, the olfactory pass can be annulled by the border guards themselves. The bee border service also includes veterinary control. A bee that has contracted an infection may not be allowed in. The same goes for a bee from another comb. Such an uninvited guest is regarded as a thief. Unfortunately, theft in the bee kingdom is quite common. Now, here's the question. We say that the guard bees won't let strangers in. What does that mean? They wouldn't block the passage with their own bodies, would they? That's right. Bee security officers have a rich arsenal of other enforcement measures. If an unwelcome guest doesn't go away on its own, they will try to deprive it of wings, antennae, and other body parts. Other guards will come to help. In the end, the crippled, helpless thief with nibbled wings is thrown to the ground where it dies. In such cases, they may not use the stingers, which are reserved for greater threats. We've mentioned that the security staff is not permanent, and its number can quickly increase due to an alarm. The alarm signal is triggered by the stinging apparatus, which secretes a complex pheromone called isoamyl acetate. When a bee stings someone, that smell causes the hive to attack. In simpler terms, the insect marks the unadvised guest as a target at the cost of its own life, because stinging means imminent death for a bee. In the face of a serious threat, the entire colony is put on high alert, and all worker bees temporarily become guards, sacrificing their lives to protect the colony in the case of urgent alarm. Individual bees position themselves at different spots around the entrance and perimeter, lift their abdomen, and slightly expose their stinger at the same time. An alarm pheromone is released. Soon, more and more new recruits take off to attack the intruder. Although all guests are uninvited, except for members of the bee family, not all may pose danger. These amazing social creatures have a unique mechanism for obtaining citizenship. A typical example is when a stray bee asks to join a family. This happens when the poor thing has flown too far from the nest and realizes it won't have the strength to return. Two potential scenarios may play out in this case. It's believed that if a bee doesn't arrive empty-handed, it will be accepted immediately and unconditionally. However, this is not entirely true. An immigrant bee, even if it brings a full crop of nectar and bags full of pollen, often has to endure a somewhat humiliating customs inspection procedure. Observant beekeepers have seen this scene more than once. First, the pleading poor thing extends its tongue with food, as if offering a bribe to the guard. The guard demonstratively ignores the offering. Instead, it climbs onto the back of the poor bee and gently touches the wings with its mandibles. The submissive immigrant endures this, bowing its head. Other guards can join the inspection, while the bee doesn't resist. Soon, the scent from the guard's cuticles transfers to the newcomer, and it's allowed through. Yes, as odd as it may seem, the essence of this procedure is simply to give the bee the scent of the colony it wishes to join. This is its residence permit. If a bee arrives empty-handed, its chances for survival are slim. It might get a passport, or it might be killed on the spot. Bees don't respect freeloaders, and like any collective animals, they don't handle individual members with kid gloves. That is why the poor fellow doesn't approach the reception desk right away, but may linger near the entrance for a long time, humbly awaiting its fate. After all, there won't be enough fuel to get home. Beekeepers say that these poor lost souls often end up dying, but more often than not, they manage to squeeze into the hive, especially when guards change shifts. Now, when the bee is sufficiently mature, developed, and experienced, begins the most important stage in its life. It becomes a flying bee and sets out to gather nectar and pollen. The first thing bees do when flying from flower to flower is drink nectar. They need it as fuel for flight, and also as a trophy, since they will use it for honey production in the future. A bee can detect the scent of a nectar-rich flower from over a mile away. Remember, they have a sense of smell comparable to dogs, or even better. How do they drink it? With their tongue, which is hidden in the proboscis. They amusingly lap up the nectar like dogs, but they can also suck it up, thus having two ways to extract nectar from a flower. The honeybee can easily handle both viscous and liquid nectar. This is what makes bees so well adapted. They can use almost any flower. Most other species specialize only in certain types of plants. In addition to nectar, bees collect floral pollen from plants as their protein food. Just like in humans, proteins serve as building materials for their bodies. But how do they manage to collect pollen, given how small and crumbly it is? It's another engineering feat in itself. Initially, as bees fly from flower to flower, they collect pollen using electricity. Yep, it's not a joke. A bee's body is densely covered with hairs. You can even find them on the eyes. As the bee flies, these hairs accumulate static electricity,
which then attracts pollen if it's essentially the same physical phenomenon that makes your own hair cling to your face when you take off a sweater. To ensure safe and convenient transportation of the pollen back to the hive, the bee immediately combs out the pollen with special brushes on its legs. While still on the flower or already in mid-air, it forms small lumps and puts them in basket-like structures on its hind legs. Meanwhile, the bee sticks the dry pollen together with a secretion from its salivary glands into a paste-like substance. This clump of pollen is called a pollen load. This is how a bee makes dozens and even hundreds of daily flights, visiting 5,000 to 7,000 flowers a day, a tremendous, grueling work. And every time, bees easily find their way home, even if they fly very far from their native hive in search of pollen and sea. They can navigate by the sun, even if it's hidden behind clouds. As you remember, bees are able to recognize polarized light. They also rely on their sense of smell and even navigate by linear landscape features like roads and rivers. In other words, a bee has a mental map of the area in its tiny head. When the bee comes back, it gives all the goodies to the young hunger bees in the hive. And you already know what happens next. But there's more to it than that. If a bee discovers a previously unknown location with nectar flowers, it will definitely share this information with friends so that they know where to fly. But how? Do they have their own language? And even if they do, they would need to convey quite complex information, as at least direction and distance. And bees can really do this. As we said, they can easily navigate their surroundings and find a way home. That's exactly how they memorize the way to nectar deposits. All that's left is to tell their colleagues about it. And bees do this by dancing. This is a whole set of characteristic movements that entomologists call waggle dance. Here's how it happens. To be precise, we are talking about a combination of two types of dance: waggle dance and round dance. The bee moves in a straight line, vigorously and quickly wagging its abdomen from side to side. Then it turns around, draws a semicircle, returns to the same spot, walks the same distance as before, shaking its belly, then turns around again in the opposite direction, returns to the same place, and repeats the cycle a few times. In this way, it creates a figure 8-shaped dance pattern, with a wavy line in the middle. What does this body language mean? The bee's dance encodes information about the direction and even the distance to the desired meadow with flowers. Although the first part is easy to believe, but the second raises questions. Indeed, the direction in which the bee goes wagging its abdomen indicates the direction of the food source. But its duration is also not random and encodes distance. Surprisingly, it's comparable to our human measurement systems. 1 second of the waggle dance corresponds to approximately 1 kilometer. Similarly, bees inform their kin about convenient drinking water bodies or new nesting sites. In these cases, the bee will show slightly different dance patterns. So if you see a bee dancing like this, it's not just having fun. This is also hard work. Indeed, the life of a worker bee is arduous labor dedicated to the colony. With a potential lifespan of several years, it only lives 30 to 40 days during the season because it literally works itself to death. And even its death aligns with the common good. During the warm season, when a bee senses imminent death, it flies outside to die so as not to bother its sisters with removing its corpse. It no longer has any obligation. It dies free right in mid-flight. The death of the drone is even more tragic. But first, let's talk about its life. You already know that drones emerge from unfertilized eggs. Thus, a drone has no father, only a mother, and is essentially her clone. This sounds strange, because we're accustomed to a clone being 100% identical, and the drone,
To put it mildly, doesn't resemble the queen. Nevertheless, they are fully genetically identical. How can this be? The answer is simple, and it's all about diet. As you remember, it's special early nutrition that makes a queen a queen. Similarly, what makes a drone is a unique diet at an early stage of development. It takes about 40 days for a drone to undergo all the stages of development from an egg to a mature male. 24 days pass between the egg stage and the emergence from the cell, that is, birth. However, Drones aren't ready to mate right after they're born. It will take another 14 to 16 days for them to fully mature. Only after this is the drone ready to fertilize a virgin queen. But such a mission is only reserved for chosen ones, a tiny percentage of all drones born during the season. Almost none of them will ever meet their queen. So what do they do all summer? Perhaps they help the worker bees. If you look at the life of a drone, one might think it's some cruel evolutionary joke on worker bees. While they work their butts off, the drone spends its life doing virtually nothing. It eats for 3, literally consuming 3 to 4 times more honey and bee breed than a worker bee. It flies around for its own pleasure, basks in the sun, and has fun. No one has any complaints against it. It can even enter another bee colony, and nothing will be held against it. The drone will even be welcome there. Do you remember what humiliation a worker bee endures trying to get accepted into a foreign hive? Drones, on the other hand, are accepted without any questions. The most it can do to help the worker bees is to ventilate the hive. When the bees flap their wings in unison to cool the room, the drone may also grace them with some sympathy flaps. To be fair, even if the drone wanted to collect pollen and nectar to build honeycombs, it wouldn't be able to. It simply lacks the tools for these tasks. Nature did not prepare it for this. However, behind all this drone idleness lies something very important, something that justifies its parasitic lifestyle. All this time, a drone's body is producing sperm to fertilize the queen in the future, and it needs to produce about 10 million sperm cells. It's an extremely energy-consuming process, which is why a drone eats for 3. Even the fact that it busily flies around all summer is not due to idleness. The drone is, in a literal sense, training to improve its endurance, flight skills, and alertness. After all, let us remind you that mating with a female occurs at a high altitude at an enormous speed, even for bees. This is why drones need to be physically fit to be up for the task. By nature's design, only the fastest and strongest drones can catch up with the queen bee. And in a colony, drones make up about 14 to 16% of the total bee population. Moreover, there are tens of thousands of regular bees in one hive, and as we know, there's only one queen. Why such an imbalance? It's simple. Everything related to reproduction is a priority for bees. Nature spares no expense in this regard, hence it produces drones in huge excess. Then, as in all of nature, the strongest will prevail. The fastest, most agile, and vigilant. Despite their short-lived triumph, they are destined to have a sad end. What will happen to the rest? Their fate is even more tragic. As the warm season winds down, nature offers less and less nectar. Bees prepare for winter, and drones become a burden. With no new nectar coming in, food must be used sparingly. The attitude towards drones in the hive is changing dramatically. At first, worker bees prevent them from feeding, pushing them away from the honey cells, and then they drive them out of the hive.
The colony altogether. By the way, how do you think smaller worker bees manage to expel the larger drones? Considering a drone is 2.5 times heavier and resists with all 6 legs, is it because there are more bees? No, it's actually much more interesting. Nature endowed female bees with alarm pheromones. Isomyl acetate is produced near the stinger and 2-heptonin near the mandibles. The latter also acts as an anesthetic similar to lidocaine. Have you ever had an anesthetic injection before dental treatment or extraction? It's the same principle. The bee first bites the male, injecting 2-heptonin to partially immobilize it, then drags it out of the nest. Interestingly, the drone's weight is not an issue. Bees are incredibly strong. They can lift a weight 30 to 40 times their own. In this respect, bees are similar to their relatives, the ants. As a result, hungry, exhausted, and almost immobilized males die en masse right at the entrance to the nest.
Sometimes bees spare several drones for the winter. For instance, if they are dissatisfied with their queen and plan to replace her after wintering. But typically, they deal with them mercilessly. We talked about queen bees, worker bees, and drones, but there is another creature in the bee kingdom that many scientists believe to have high intelligence and possibly even a semblance of a mind. The creature is a hive itself. Hive mind, swarm intelligence, group intelligence. Although science fiction writers use these terms left and right, they didn't actually come from this genre. Scientists have been studying the behavior of social insects for a long time, continually amazed at how thousands of individuals can engage in coherent, rational behavior, which sometimes even seems conscious. And some of these discoveries can send shivers down your spine. This collective organism never hibernates. The hive simply waits out the cold season. The bees huddle in a tight ball and warm each other up with their bodies. They feed on honey and pollen stored over the summer. To keep the hive clean, they don't relieve themselves, holding it in until spring, when they can go outside. Many bees don't survive the winter. Sometimes by spring, the bottom of the hive is covered in a carpet of dead bees. But even after a sharp population decrease during winter, the bee family can quickly recover during the season and continue to live. And each colony has its own unique life. Any beekeeper will tell you that each bee colony has its peculiarities and even its own personality in a psychological sense of the word. There are strong colonies and there are weak ones. Some hives calmly survive the winter while others die out completely, although they stand side by side. Moreover, there are calmer and more aggressive colonies with the same apiary. Each hive behaves like a whole separate entity. It seems as if this unfathomable collective being is capable of planning. The group intelligence decides to replace the queen. It also decides to keep a certain number of drones for the winter, just in case. Finally, at some point, it decides to create a new colony, which is something truly miraculous in itself. This process is called swarming. It's a natural, yet quite spectacular phenomenon that almost all beekeepers encounter in one way or another in their practice. However, it can catch a novice beekeeper off guard and genuinely scare a layperson. Bees fly out of the hive with a powerful buzz and cluster on a nearby tree, bush, or fence. After a couple of hours, as if on command, this whole crowd takes off in an unknown direction. But everything becomes much more interesting when you look behind the scenes. It all starts when a combination
Of factors prompts the bee family to prepare for forming a new colony. This could be due to overcrowding from an increased population, the space being completely filled with honeycombs, or some other factors. The stronger the bee colony, the greater the chance it will display swarming behavior. What happens then? The bees begin to create queen cells where future queens can grow. 8 days after laying, the bees seal the queen cells, and 2 to 3 days later, it's time for the swarm to exit the hive. The swarm flies out on a warm, sunny day, usually before noon. The old queen flies out of the hive together with the swarm. Due to her age and build, and the fact that her flying skills are a bit rusty, the queen cannot fly quickly for an extended time. Therefore, it usually settles on the nearest branch, bush, or fence. The rest of the bees from the migration team follow her scent. There can be many such bees, tens of thousands, up to 2/3 of the maternal family. It takes about 5 minutes for the swarm to depart,
after which the new colony hangs in a large cluster on the branch or bush. It stays there for 3 to 5 hours before taking off in a direction known only to it. Occasionally, a swarm may linger for a few days. One might wonder, what is going on there all this time? Believe it or not, this is when real debates and voting take place. While the swarm hangs at a temporary location, scout bees scatter in all directions. Their task is to find a suitable place to establish a new colony. They fly around all potentially suitable places, such as tree hollows, large logs, birdhouses, attics, etc. The main criteria are protection from bad weather and predators, as well as spaciousness. Having enough room is critical for survival, after all. Bees need substantial supplies of honey and pollen to overwinter successfully. When scout bees discover suitable places, they return to the swarm's temporary site and perform the same waggle dance we've told you about. And here's the most interesting part. Different bees bring data from various places. They tell their relatives, "We need to fly over there." But how to decide to do this? Other bees go to the specified places and check if everything's okay. If so, they return and dance in the same direction, thereby affirming their solidarity with those who went there before. The process is repeated. The bees compare places in this way until gradually one direction is deemed as the best by the majority. As soon as the bees reach a consensus, the swarm immediately takes off and goes to a new location. This is a remarkable example of such tiny creatures exhibiting clear signs of a democratic society. While swarming behavior can be easily explained, other consensus decisions of the bee family remain inexplicable. For example, beekeepers sometimes observe absconding in the fall, commonly known as colony collapse disorder. It involves bees leaving the hive for unknown reasons, even though there's enough food inside for wintering. Why? No one knows for sure. Again, one can't help but think that bees are not quite what they seem. We're back to where we started. Although tons of scientific literature have been written about bees, we hardly seem to know anything about them. The honeybees were the first domesticated insects, or at least we consider them domesticated. They may have a different opinion. They don't perceive us as overlords. They likely don't perceive us as beings at all. We've been around for 100,000 years. They've been around for 100 million. To them, we're just a strange and fleeting phenomenon of nature that began and will end just as suddenly.